Picture this, not on some blood-soaked battlefield, but within the hushed, candlelit silence of a monastic cell. The future of warfare was being quietly rewritten. While kings and generals clashed openly with sword and shield, a hidden revolution in military strategy was taking place far from the front lines, penned by hands that held both a quill and a sword. These were the scholar knights, devout members of monastic orders like the Templars and the Teutonic Knights, who became the unexpected masterminds behind some of the most sophisticated tactical advances of the Middle Ages. In an age where knowledge was power, they understood something profound. That true strength lay not only in force of arms, but in the wisdom preserved on parchment, passed down through generations in plain sight, yet hidden in plain sight. We often imagine medieval monks as isolated figures, devoted entirely to prayer and contemplation, but the reality is far more fascinating and far more strategic. Behind monastery walls, these warrior scholars were compiling, illustrating, and encrypting manuals on everything from siege engineering and cavalry maneuvers to intelligence gathering and logistics. Their illuminated manuscripts were more than just religious art. They were detailed blueprints for war, disguised within sacred texts, psalters, and biblical commentaries. This was knowledge so valuable, so potentially devastating if fallen into the wrong hands, that it had to be protected through ciphers, codes, and layers of allegory. What began as spiritual duty evolved into a clandestine mission to gather, refine, and conceal the cutting-edge military science of their time. So join me as we step into the secret world of these guardians of hidden knowledge, a world where faith and warfare intertwined in the most unexpected ways. We'll uncover how these quiet rooms of scribes and thinkers shaped the outcomes of crusades, defended kingdoms, and left a legacy that still influences how we think about strategy and secrecy today. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about the enduring power of ideas, the art of preserving wisdom, and the surprising places where history's greatest innovations are often born. You're about to discover how books became weapons, how monks became spies, and how the echoes of their work can still be felt in the world we live in now. The 12th century was an age of profound contradiction, a time when the clash of steel echoed through holy places, and the line between piety and violence blurred beyond recognition. It all began with the cry of Deus Vult, God wills it, as Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade, sending waves of European knights toward Jerusalem. But in the chaotic aftermath of that initial campaign, a new kind of institution was born from sheer necessity. The roads to the Holy Land were perilous, plagued by bandits and rival forces, leaving pilgrims dangerously exposed. In response, a small group of knights, led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens, made a radical vow. They would become monks, but monks who did not renounce the sword. Instead, they would dedicate their lives to protecting the vulnerable travelers journeying to sacred sites. In 1119, King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them quarters on the Temple Mount, and so the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights Templar, were formally established. This was the genesis of the monastic military order, a unique fusion that seemed almost unthinkable to many at the time. How could a man take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while also swearing to kill in defense of the faith? The Church itself wrestled with this paradox, but ultimately sanctioned these orders, seeing them as a necessary instrument for divine will. The Templars were soon followed by others, like the Knights Hospitaller, who began as caregivers for the sick in Jerusalem before evolving into a powerful military force, and later the Teutonic Knights, founded to aid German crusaders and pilgrims. Each order answered a specific need, but they all shared that core dual identity. They were, in essence, warrior monks, living a life divided between the chapel and the training ground. Their daily existence was governed by a strict rule, a detailed code that dictated every hour. Their day would begin long before sunrise with the divine office, chanting psalms and prayers in a cold stone chapel. This would be followed by periods of manual labor, study, and then intensive martial training. This structured rhythm was the secret to their success. The monastic discipline provided the mental fortitude and organizational structure, while the constant combat drills honed their physical prowess. It was within this rigid framework that a culture of knowledge preservation could truly flourish. Unlike secular knights who might be concerned with personal glory or feudal disputes, these men were part of a collective, an international organization with a unified purpose. What one knight learned on a battlefield in the Levant could be documented, refined, and sent back to a commandery in France or England, becoming part of a growing, shared body of strategic wisdom. This environment turned their preceptories into early think tanks for military science. The very act of copying manuscripts, a standard monastic practice, was applied to texts far beyond the Bible. A brother who was a skilled scribe might spend his afternoon meticulously illustrating a diagram of a new trebuchet design, while a knight who had just returned from the frontier could dictate his observations on effective counterinsurgency tactics against light cavalry. Their libraries began to fill with works on mathematics for engineering, astronomy for navigation, medicine for field surgery, and of course, detailed commentaries on classical military theorists like Vegetius. They weren't just preserving old knowledge, they were actively creating new, empirical knowledge based on their extensive frontline experience. This systematic approach to developing, testing, and recording tactics set them apart from every other military force of the era, and laid the essential groundwork for their role as the covert custodians of warfare's most guarded secrets. Now step inside one of these monastic strongholds and follow the dim light of a flickering candle down a cold stone corridor. You enter a room thick with the scent of beeswax, ink, and parchment. This is the Scriptorium, the true engine room of the Order's power. Here, the sounds of the outside world fade away, replaced by the soft scratching of quills and the quiet turning of vellum pages. This is where the scholar knights performed one of their most vital duties, but it was about far more than simply copying psalms and prayer books. In these hushed spaces, the art of war was being systematically studied, refined, and preserved for future generations. The men bent over these writing desks were not typical monks. Many were brothers who had seen combat, knights who traded their swords for styluses to translate their hard-won experience into permanent instruction. Their subject matter was a far cry from typical devotional work. One scribe might be carefully diagramming the optimal angle for a trebuchet's trajectory, his illustration nestled innocently within the borders of a biblical scene. Another could be encrypting notes on the weaknesses of a particular style of castle wall, disguising them as marginalia, those decorative notes in the margins of a page. A third might be translating a captured Arabic manual on advanced mathematics, recognizing its immediate application for calculating supply lines and siege durations. The Scriptorium was, in effect, a highly classified military research and development center, operating under the perfect cover of religious devotion. The physical creation of these books was a monumental effort in itself, a testament to their immense value. It began with the parchment made from the skin of sheep or calves, soaked, stretched, and scraped until it was perfectly smooth. Inks were meticulously hand-mixed from soot, gallnuts, and minerals, producing a rich black or vibrant colors like vermilion and ultramarine blue, the latter made from precious lapis lazuli imported from distant Afghanistan. Each word was penned with a quill, sharpened to a fine point, and a single mistake could mean days of work scraped away and started anew. This painstaking process ensured that every completed manuscript was a durable treasure, built to last for centuries and be passed from hand to hand, from one generation of knights to the next. But these rooms were more than just production facilities. They were intellectual crossroads. The Monastic Network, with its commanderies stretching from the British Isles to the shores of the Holy Land, acted as a vast information-gathering web. A Hospitaller knight returning from the borderlands of Anatolia might bring with him a captured Seljuk manual on horse archery. A Templar envoy from Iberia could deliver a newly acquired translation of a classical Roman text on military engineering, preserved for centuries in a Muslim library. In the Scriptorium, these diverse streams of knowledge converged. Scribes and scholars would compare, contrast, and synthesize this information, merging Roman siegecraft with Islamic cavalry tactics and their own first-hand observations to create a hybrid, superior form of military science that was uniquely their own. This constant influx and integration of ideas turned the quiet Scriptorium into the humming heart of medieval strategic innovation, where the future of warfare was quietly, deliberately written into existence. While the Scriptorium was the workshop, the true treasure lay in the vaults, the legendary secret libraries of the Knights Templar. Their vast network of preceptories, stretching from the rocky coasts of Scotland to the deserts of Outremer, functioned as more than just military bases. They were nodes in an elaborate intelligence network and repositories for a growing horde of forbidden knowledge. Each new castle they garrisoned, each territory they secured, offered another opportunity to acquire texts. They gathered classical military treatises from crumbling Italian monasteries, captured tactical manuals from Muslim armies, and received esoteric works as gifts from allied Eastern Christian sects. This systematic collection gave them an unparalleled archive, a comprehensive library of warfare that no single king or university could hope to match. The sheer value of this knowledge demanded extreme measures of protection. Many of their most sensitive manuscripts were not simply stored but were encrypted, written in complex ciphers known only to high-ranking brothers. Some historians suggest they used a sophisticated alphabet substitution code, while others point to more esoteric methods, like embedding tactical diagrams within the geometric patterns of illuminated letters. A biblical scene of David and Goliath might, upon closer inspection by an initiated member, reveal detailed annotations on sling-based artillery, or how to exploit the weak points in a giant's armor, a metaphor for attacking a much larger force. This practice of hiding military science in plain sight ensured that even if a book fell into the wrong hands, its true meaning would remain locked away, accessible only to those who held the key. The most famous and sought after of these texts was the elusive Templar rulebook, a document far more extensive than the basic Latin rule given to them by Bernard of Clairvaux. This expanded version, rumored to exist in a handful of copies, was their operational manual. It's believed to have contained not just spiritual guidelines but advanced, proto-modern doctrines on everything from guerrilla warfare, how to use small, fast units to harass larger enemy formations, to sophisticated intelligence-gathering techniques. It would have detailed how to run networks of informants, how to encode messages using seemingly innocent merchant ledgers, and standard procedures for interrogating prisoners to extract militarily useful information. This book was the ultimate expression of their dual nature, blending prayer with pragmatism in a guide for holy war. Their financial prowess is well known, but we must understand that their literary assets were arguably just as valuable, if not more so, than their mountains of silver and gold. A chest of coins could pay for an army, but a single manual detailing a new siege engine design or the vulnerabilities of a specific enemy's supply chain could win a war. This intellectual capital gave them a strategic advantage that made them indispensable to kings and popes, who often sought their counsel not just for their swords but for their minds. The true power of the Templars wasn't just in their armed might or their wealth. It was in the accumulated wisdom contained within their hidden libraries, making them the guardians of the medieval world's most dangerous and coveted secrets. But how exactly did they keep this explosive knowledge from falling into the wrong hands? The answer lies in a breathtaking fusion of art and espionage, where sacred pages became canvases for clandestine communication. These monastic orders developed a sophisticated array of encryption techniques that would feel surprisingly modern, transforming their manuscripts into locked chests of military science. They understood that in the wrong hands, a diagram of a castle's weak point or a formula for Greek fire could lead to disaster, so they wrapped their secrets in layers of beautiful, bewildering code. One of the most common methods was the use of acrostics, where the first letter of each line in a seemingly innocent prayer or hymn would spell out a hidden message. A hymn praising the Virgin Mary might, when read vertically by an initiated brother, reveal instructions for a specific cavalry formation or a warning about a traitor within a royal court. To anyone else, it was simply a beautiful piece of devotional text. More complex were numerical codes, where numbers corresponding to letters in a pre-agreed cipher, like a Caesar shift or a substitution grid, were hidden within dates, chapter numbers, or even the counts of specific recurring words in a biblical passage. A chronicle listing the 120 attendees at a council might actually be signaling the coordinates for a hidden supply cache or the strength of an approaching enemy force. Perhaps the most visually stunning encryption was embedded directly into the illuminations themselves. Consider a magnificent, gilded illustration of the walls of Jericho tumbling down. To the average viewer, it's a powerful depiction of a biblical miracle, but to a trained Templar, the precise geometric patterns in the falling bricks could map out the optimal angles for sapping, undermining a fortress wall. The number of angels hovering above might indicate the required number of sappers, while the colors of their robes could denote the type of tools needed. In another example, a beautifully illustrated family tree of Christ, a common feature in medieval Bibles, might use the branching lines and connecting nodes to secretly diagram a complex battle plan, showing troop movements and reserve positions. The artistry wasn't just for show, it was the perfect camouflage, ensuring that even if a book was captured in battle, its most vital intelligence remained secure, visible yet utterly invisible to the uninitiated eye. This blend of deep faith and cunning pragmatism allowed the scholar knights to operate in a world of shadows, protecting their most dangerous ideas behind a veil of dazzling, devout beauty. Yet beyond their beauty, these illustrations served a deeply practical purpose as advanced training manuals for a warrior class where literacy was far from universal. A knight might struggle to decipher a dense paragraph of Latin text describing a pincer movement, but he could instantly understand a vibrant, full-page miniature showing two blocks of crimson-clad cavalry converging on a blue-coated enemy force. The artists employed a sophisticated visual language. Specific colors consistently represented different units or orders, standardized symbols denoted types of soldiers or equipment, and arrows and lines choreographed the flow of movement across the parchment battlefield. A gilded line sweeping around the edge of an illumination wasn't just a border. It could be a prescribed cavalry route, while a series of small, repeated dots might represent the pace and intervals for an infantry advance. These books transformed abstract tactical theory into something concrete, visual, and unforgettable. Consider the challenge of explaining the complex mechanics of a massive trebuchet. A textual description would be long, technical, and prone to misinterpretation by a layman, but an illuminated manuscript could present a stunning, cut-away diagram. The counterweight, often painted a heavy lead gray, would be shown in precise relation to the throwing arm, perhaps colored a golden yellow to signify wood. The sling pouch might be depicted at the exact moment of release, with delicate lines arcing outward to show the trajectory of the projectile. Such an image allowed a siege master to visually communicate critical adjustments, lengthening the sling for more distance or adding weight for more impact without a single written word. These were not generic pictures, they were technically accurate blueprints drawn by scribes who likely consulted with the very engineers who built these fearsome machines. The true genius of this system was its application in the field. We can easily imagine a Templar commander on the eve of a battle in the arid hills of the Holy Land, gathering his officers not with a scroll but with a large, leather-bound book. He would open it to a specific illuminated page, pointing to a diagram that mirrored the terrain before them. "Our sergeants will form here like this," he might say, indicating a block of infantry depicted in the manuscript. "And our knights will wait in reserve in this valley, exactly as shown here." He'd continue, tracing the path of the gilded cavalry figures on the page. The book became an interactive command tool, a shared visual reference that ensured every unit leader understood his role in the coming engagement. This shared visual language bridged gaps of rank, experience, and even native tongue within these international orders, creating a common operational picture that was far more effective than shouted orders or hastily drawn sketches in the dirt. This reliance on visual storytelling also reveals a profound understanding of human psychology and memory. A complex battle plan described in a lecture might be forgotten amidst the chaos and adrenaline of combat. But a plan that had been studied, its components represented by vivid, beautiful, and symbolic images, would lodge itself firmly in the mind. A knight would remember the golden lion representing his battalion's standard and its position next to the blue river on the page, helping him find his place on the actual battlefield. The stunning artistry wasn't frivolous, it was a mnemonic device making the critical details of strategy more memorable and therefore more executable under pressure. In this way, these illuminated manuscripts were far more than simple books. They were the crucial link between theoretical knowledge learned in the tranquility of the monastery and its practical, life-or-death application on the screaming confusion of the medieval battlefield. While the monastic orders were masters of visual communication and encryption, their intellectual ambitions reached far beyond the battlefields of their own time, stretching back centuries to the very foundations of Western military thought. They recognized that to dominate the future of warfare, they needed to reclaim the lost wisdom of the past, and in doing so, they became the vital bridge that saved classical strategic knowledge from vanishing into the Dark Ages. The works of Roman military theorists like Flavius Vegetius Renatus, whose book, De Re Militare, was the closest thing the ancient world had to a comprehensive manual of war, and Sextus Julius Frontinus, whose Strategemata was a collection of cunning military stratagems, were not just academic curiosities to these monk knights. They were living texts, blueprints to be studied, debated, and most importantly, updated. The process began with a monumental effort of recovery and translation. In the great scriptoria of orders like the Cistercians, who are closely aligned with the Templars, teams of multilingual brothers would work on painstaking translations. A Greek text on siege engines, perhaps preserved for centuries in a Byzantine monastery, would first be translated into Latin by a brother fluent in both languages. But the job wasn't finished there. Another brother, a veteran knight who had actually commanded trebuchet crews at the siege of Acre, would then annotate the translation, scribbling notes in the margins. He might point out where Vegetius's advice on building a ram was sound, but then add a crucial modification based on his own experience with newer, more resilient types of castle walls that the Romans had never encountered. The pristine classical text was thus layered with a living, breathing commentary of contemporary experience, creating a hybrid document that was far more valuable than the original. This synthesis is where their true genius lay. They didn't slavishly copy the old ways, they tested them against the hard realities of modern combat. For instance, the classical Roman legion relied on heavy infantry fighting in tight, disciplined formations. A monastic strategist studying this would immediately see its value, but also its limitations against the fast-moving horse archers of the steppes. His marginal note might read, "The testudo formation is effective against arrows from above, as the author says, but against the hit-and-run tactics of the Turcopoles, we have found greater success with a combined force of dismounted sergeants to hold the center and swift light cavalry to harass the flanks." See the account of the battle at Jacob's Ford. This constant feedback loop from ancient text to contemporary application, back to annotated text, meant their tactical manuals were never static. They were evolving organisms of knowledge. The scope of their intellectual curiosity extended beyond pure military manuals into the realms of philosophy and science, which they understood were the bedrock of advanced strategy. The works of Aristotle, particularly his writings on logic, ethics, and physics, were intensely studied not for abstract debate but for practical application. His logical frameworks helped them structure complex decision-making trees for commanders in the field. His ethical ideas were wrestled with to justify the moral complexities of holy war. Most practically, his and Euclid's principles of geometry were essential for the engineers calculating the trajectories of stones launched from trebuchets or the optimal angles for building defensive walls. A beautifully illuminated manuscript of Aristotle's Physics in a Templar library wasn't just a status symbol. It was a tool, its principles directly applied to the engineering challenges of undermining a fortress or constructing a floating bridge for an assault. This relentless drive to merge the old with the new created a dynamic, ever-refining body of tactical wisdom that was passed down through the order's ranks like a sacred inheritance. A young novice knight would begin his education not only by learning to swing a sword, but by studying these annotated, hybridized texts. He would absorb the core principles of Vegetius on supply logistics, see how a 13th century master had adapted it for long desert campaigns, and then hear firsthand accounts from veterans who had put it all into practice. This continuous thread, connecting the wisdom of a Roman general from the 4th century to the experience of a Crusader knight in the 12th, and then to the education of a new recruit in the 13th, gave the monastic orders an unparalleled depth of institutional knowledge. They weren't just fighting the wars of their day, they were building upon a cumulative, 1,000-year-old conversation about the art of war itself, ensuring that the hard-won lessons of history were never forgotten, but constantly refined for the battles yet to come. While the Templars were forging their legacy in the sun-scorched deserts of the Holy Land, another order was writing a very different chapter in the cold, unforgiving forests and marshes of the north. The Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, known to history as the Teutonic Knights, began with a similar mission of caring for pilgrims. But their destiny pulled them eastward into a brutal centuries-long struggle that would force them to become masters of a completely new kind of warfare. Their enemies were not the organized armies of Saladin, but the fierce pagan tribes of the Baltic, the Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians, who knew their homelands intimately and fought with a terrifying, unpredictable ferocity. To survive and eventually dominate this alien environment, the Teutonic Knights had to innovate relentlessly, and they documented every hard-learned lesson in meticulous detail, creating a body of tactical knowledge uniquely suited to the eastern frontier. The landscape itself was their first and greatest adversary. Unlike the open fields ideal for the classic heavy cavalry charge favored in the west-northeastern Europe was a world of dense, dark forests, vast trackless bogs, and frozen rivers. A column of plate-armored knights was worse than useless here. It was a death trap, easily ambushed from the tree line or mired in swampy ground. The Teutonic Chronicles are filled with grim accounts of campaigns that failed due to a commander's ignorance of the terrain. In response, their tactical manuals placed an obsessive emphasis on what we would now call terrain intelligence. They didn't just draw maps, they created detailed itineraries that cataloged the condition of forest trails after rain, the depth of river fords at different times of year, and the locations of patches of solid ground in otherwise impassable swamps. This written knowledge transformed their network of brick and stone castles like the mighty Marienburg from mere strongholds into a system of interconnected intelligence hubs, each one a repository of localized knowledge that could be shared up and down the chain of command. Perhaps their most significant innovation was the development of a doctrine for winter warfare, a concept almost unheard of in medieval Europe where armies typically hibernated during the coldest months. The pagan tribes, however, viewed winter as their ally, using frozen rivers and bogs as natural highways for swift raids. The Teutonic Knights turned this advantage against them. Their manuals detailed specialized equipment and techniques for winter campaigns. They described the use of sleds and skis for moving supplies and troops faster than any marching army could manage, and they outlined the construction of insulated field shelters. They learned to time their attacks during deep freezes, when the very marshes that protected pagan villages became solid enough to support a charge of heavy horse. A campaign in the year 1290, recorded in the Chronicle of Peter of Duisburg, describes a force of knights using precisely this tactic, crossing a frozen wilderness believed to be impassable to launch a surprise attack on a Prussian fortress at a time when its defenders believed themselves completely safe from assault. This constant adaptation extended to their very structure and choice of allies. Recognizing the limitations of their own heavy cavalry, the Teutonic Order became masters of combined arms warfare, integrating lighter local auxiliaries into their forces. Their manuals prescribed specific roles for these different units. Native Livonian and Estonian light cavalry, armed with javelins and bows, were deployed as scouts and skirmishers to harass the enemy and draw them into ambushes. German and Danish crusaders who arrived seasonally on what were called Reisen or crusading tours formed the heavy shock cavalry, and the corps brother knights themselves acted as the disciplined professional backbone, holding the line and directing the battle. This tactical flexibility, all carefully outlined in their texts, allowed them to fight effectively against a wide range of foes, from the skirmishing tribes of the forests to the more conventional armies of the Novgorod Republic. The success of their entire enterprise depended on the relentless recording and dissemination of this hard-won knowledge. After each campaign, commanders were expected to provide detailed reports that were then compiled into updated tactical manuals and circulated throughout their commanderies. These weren't theoretical essays, they were practical, gritty field guides. One surviving fragment advises on how to identify signs of an impending ambush by noting subtle disturbances in bird flight patterns overhead. Another details the most effective way to construct a fortified camp in a pine forest using felled trees and snowbanks. This culture of institutional learning, where every victory and every defeat was analyzed and its lessons preserved in writing, gave the Teutonic Order a staggering advantage over their less organized adversaries. They weren't just bringing faith and steel to the Baltic. They were bringing a system, a growing encyclopedia of specialized warfare that allowed them to gradually tame a wild frontier and build a powerful state where once there was only wilderness and conflict. Of all the challenges a medieval commander could face, none was more complex, more expensive, or more decisive than a siege. A field battle could be over in hours, but a siege could drag on for months, testing not just courage but logistics, engineering, and sheer intellectual endurance. It was in this domain that the hidden knowledge of the monastic orders truly proved its worth, transforming the slow, grinding process of reducing a fortress into something closer to a precise science. Their most guarded manuscripts were not about grand cavalry charges, but about the meticulous art of siegecraft, detailed engineering manuals that covered everything from the mathematics of projectile motion to the psychology of a garrison under pressure. These texts turned the chaotic nightmare of a siege into a series of calculated, methodical steps. At the heart of this knowledge were the terrifying engines of destruction, and none was more revered than the trebuchet, the ultimate expression of medieval physics. A monastic siege manual wouldn't just tell a brother how to build one, it would provide exhaustive, step-by-step instructions. It began with the selection of timber, specifying the type of wood needed for the massive throwing arm, likely a single, enormous oak trunk, versus the sturdy pine for the frame. The text would then detail the complex joinery, the precise pivot points, and most crucially, the mathematics behind the counterweight. A well-known formula passed down through these texts dictated the relationship between the weight of the counterweight box, the length of the throwing arm, and the desired range. The counterweight itself was an engineering project. The manual might advise filling a giant wooden box with tons of lead, stones, or even sand. But the most effective and terrifying counterweight, hinted at in some texts, was something far more grim and readily available. The bodies of dead soldiers or prisoners, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. But building the machine was only half the battle. The manuals then delved into its operation with the detail of a modern technical guide. They provided firing tables how far a 100-pound stone would fly with a counterweight of a specific weight dropped from a specific height. They covered the critical adjustment of the sling's length and the hook's release mechanism to achieve the right trajectory for the target. A high, arcing shot was for dropping projectiles over walls to smash buildings and morale inside the fortress, while a lower, faster shot was for battering a specific section of wall into rubble. The illuminations in these books brought these concepts to life. A stunning diagram might show a trebuchet from multiple angles, with different colored lines indicating stress points on the frame or the optimal arc of fire, turning a page of parchment into an interactive training simulator for the master engineer. Of course, not all siegecraft was about throwing rocks. The manuals devoted entire chapters to the ancient and terrifying art of mining, sapping. This was a subterranean game of cat and mouse, and the texts provided a detailed playbook. They instructed on how to select the best spot to start a mine, often near a corner of a tower or wall where the foundations might be weaker. They described the construction of the tunnel itself, using heavy wooden props to prevent collapse, and the use of bellows to pump air down to the miners who worked in stifling, pitch-black conditions. The goal was to dig a chamber directly beneath the foundation, fill it with combustible material like pig fat and timber, set it ablaze, and then collapse the tunnel, hoping the burning supports would cause the masonry above to crack and tumble. But the defenders would be listening for the telltale sound of picks, and would often dig counter-mines to break into the attackers' tunnels, leading to horrific, claustrophobic fights in the dark. The manuals prepared the sappers for this, offering advice on how to muffle sound and how to defend a tunnel intersection with shields and short spears. For a direct assault, the orders documented the construction of massive mobile towers or belfries. These were multi-story wooden castles on wheels towering over the landscape. The manuscripts were essentially architectural plans specifying the dimensions, the type of wheels needed for the terrain, and the crucial covering of fresh, wet animal hides to protect the structure from fire arrows. The most sophisticated point was the drawbridge mechanism at the top level. The manual would detail the pulleys and ropes that would drop a bridge directly onto the enemy's battlements, allowing knights to swarm across. The entire process of moving such a behemoth was also covered how teams of oxen or men would push it forward over a smoothed path, often under a hail of arrows and stones, making it a slow, nerve-wracking endeavor. We can see the real-world application of this written knowledge in famous sieges like the Siege of Acre during the Third Crusade. The Templars and Hospitallers were instrumental in the year-long struggle to take the city, and chronicles of the time note their expertise in managing the complex siege works. They would have consulted their manuals to position their trebuchets for maximum effect against Acre's formidable double walls, and their sappers would have used their knowledge to relentlessly probe for weaknesses in the foundations. The final victory was not just a triumph of bravery, but a testament to the meticulous application of engineered knowledge preserved in their libraries. Similarly, during the Teutonic Order's relentless conquest of Prussia, their methodical approach to reducing pagan wooden fortresses using pre-designed templates for siege engines adapted for the local materials shows a clear pattern of standardized, written doctrine being applied across different theaters of war. This wasn't random violence, it was the systematic execution of a plan that began not on a battlefield, but on a parchment page in a quiet monastic library, where faith and physics met to reshape the very landscape of war. Yet for all their power, the classic heavy cavalry charge was a blunt instrument, a single, thunderous note in what could be a complex symphony of battle. The true mastery of the monastic orders lay in their development and documentation of far more sophisticated maneuvers, turning a mass of armored knights into a versatile and responsive instrument of the commander's will. Among the most difficult and effective of these was the feigned retreat, a tactic that required immense discipline and perfect timing. The concept was simple in theory but perilous in execution. A squadron of knights would launch a furious assault, then suddenly break and appear to flee in panic, tempting the enemy to break their own disciplined formation and give reckless chase. This was the critical moment, as the pursuing enemy soldiers stretched themselves into a vulnerable, disordered mob. A second, hidden squadron of fresh knights would sweep in from the flanks, while the fleeing knights would suddenly wheel around and counterattack. The result was a devastating trap. The risk, of course, was monumental. A feigned retreat could easily collapse into a very real rout if the knight's nerve broke or if the supporting units failed to arrive on time. This is where the written manuals were indispensable. They didn't just describe the tactic, they drilled into the specifics of its execution. They detailed the precise signals, a specific blast from a horn, the raising of a particular banner, that would initiate the feigned flight and then the counter-turn. They analyzed the ideal terrain for such a maneuver, often recommending a slight rise that could conceal the ambushing reserve force until the last possible second. Most importantly, they emphasized the psychological conditioning required. A knight had to be trained to overcome his instinctive sense of honor and shame, to understand that a tactical withdrawal was not cowardice but the highest form of strategic cunning. This level of complex, coordinated action, repeated across different battles and theaters, was only possible because it was studied, standardized, and preserved in text, allowing it to be taught to every new generation of brothers. Beyond these grand maneuvers, the manuals exhibited an almost scientific obsession with the granular details that made a cavalry force effective. A significant portion of these texts was devoted to the science of horse breeding and veterinary care. They understood that the knight was only as good as his mount, and that a successful charge depended on the strength, speed, and endurance of the warhorse. These manuscripts read like early genetic logs, detailing which bloodlines produced the largest destriers capable of carrying a fully armored knight, which were best for the lighter, faster coursers used for scouting and pursuit, and which regional breeds had the toughest constitutions for long campaigns. They included remedies for common ailments, instructions for feeding regiments to build muscle without making the animal sluggish, and guides to hoof care to prevent lameness. This wasn't just animal husbandry, it was military logistics at the most fundamental level, ensuring the Order's most vital living assets remained battle-ready. The analysis extended to the knight himself, with detailed commentaries on armor effectiveness that went far beyond simply listing pieces of equipment. The manuals would discuss the trade-offs between different types of steel, the optimal design for a helmet to balance protection with visibility and airflow, and the way armor weight distribution affected a knight's fatigue during a long engagement. They even covered the evolution of weaponry, analyzing the best lance construction for a sustained charge versus a single, shattering impact. This relentless drive for optimization was rooted in a pragmatic, almost clinical assessment of battlefield results. After a conflict, commanders would debrief their knights, asking what worked and what didn't. Was a new style of gauntlet flexible enough? Did a new saddle design improve stability? These empirical findings were then written down, creating a continuously improving database of equipment reviews that would make any modern product tester proud. All of this knowledge, the grand tactics, the breeding programs, the equipment reviews, was often deliberately veiled within the pages of seemingly benign texts. A lengthy allegorical treatise on the armor of God from the Epistle to the Ephesians provided the perfect cover. A passage discussing the breastplate of righteousness could contain a detailed subtext on the metallurgical qualities of a superior breastplate, its ability to deflect a lance strike, and the most righteous or effective angle to present it to an opponent. A meditation on the shield of faith might be annotated with notes on the optimal grip for a kite shield to deflect blows while leaving the right arm free to attack. This layered writing style served a dual purpose. It protected the sensitive military information from casual observers, and it spiritually fortified the knight, reinforcing the idea that his physical prowess and his spiritual devotion were two sides of the same coin. He was not just wearing armor, he was clad in divine virtue. He was not just executing a feigned retreat, he was practicing holy cunning against the forces of darkness. This fusion of the practical and the pious in their written doctrine created a warrior who was not only supremely skilled but also ferociously motivated, believing heaven itself guided the point of his lance. Beyond the clash of steel and the roar of siege engines, the most potent weapon in the monastic order's arsenal was often the simplest: information. Their role as intelligence operatives is a chapter of their history that remains shrouded in even greater secrecy than their encrypted manuals, yet it was arguably the foundation upon which all their other successes were built. The very thing that made them unique, their identity as pious, seemingly pacifistic monks, provided the perfect cover for a sprawling, international spy network. A man in a simple robe carrying a Bible and speaking of peace could travel through hostile territory with a freedom no royal envoy or armored scout could ever hope to achieve. This religious cloak granted them unparalleled access, turning every pilgrimage route, every diplomatic mission, and every monastic house into a potential node in a vast intelligence-gathering web. The methods they employed were sophisticated and multifaceted. Consider the humble pilgrim. While genuine devout travelers certainly existed, the orders would also dispatch their own brothers on pilgrimages with very specific secondary objectives. A Templar traveling to Santiago de Compostela in Spain would do more than just visit the shrine. His true mission might be to mentally map the mountain passes of Navarre, noting their width, condition, and potential for ambush. He would discreetly count the number of guards on Moorish castles he passed, estimate the strength of their garrisons by the smoke from their kitchens, and strike up conversations in taverns to learn about local allegiances and tensions. Every inn was a listening post, every fellow traveler a potential source of information. Upon his return, this brother would not just deliver a verbal report. He would sit down with a scribe and contribute to the order's ever-growing collection of itineraries, detailed written accounts of routes, complete with notes on water sources, foraging opportunities, and defensive points. On a more formal level, the orders were frequently called upon to act as diplomats and negotiators, roles they eagerly accepted for the intelligence windfall they provided. A high-ranking Hospitaller commander sent to negotiate a prisoner exchange with a Muslim emir would be paying very close attention to everything beyond the bargaining table. The state of repair of the emir's fortress walls, the morale of his soldiers, the level of supplies in his storerooms, all of this was priceless military intelligence. He would note the emir's demeanor. Was he confident or desperate? Were his advisors united or arguing? These psychological insights could reveal much about the enemy's willingness to fight or their vulnerability to pressure. These diplomatic reports, often written in cipher, were then cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources, building a comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. The real genius of their system, however, lay in the feedback loop they created between espionage and strategy. The intelligence gathered by these monkish spies didn't just sit in a vault. It was directly integrated into their tactical manuals and operational planning. For example, a report from a brother in Antioch detailing a new type of lightweight saddle used by Turkish horse archers, which allowed for greater mobility and faster shooting, would be sent back to the Grand Master. The order's strategists would then analyze this information and, if deemed valuable, draft a new section for their cavalry manual. This section would outline the potential threat of this new technology and propose counter-tactics, perhaps recommending specific arrowhead designs to better pierce the lighter armor of these fast-moving units or new formations to minimize the impact of their arrows. The updated manual would then be disseminated to commanders in the field. The next time a Templar contingent faced those Turkish horse archers, they wouldn't be encountering an unknown threat. They would be implementing a pre-prepared, written doctrine designed specifically to counter it. This continuous cycle of observation, analysis, dissemination, and application gave them an adaptive edge that more static, traditional armies simply could not match. Perhaps one of the most compelling anecdotes involves the Teutonic Order's expansion into Prussia. Before launching a campaign into a new area, they would first send small teams of brothers disguised as traders or missionaries into the pagan territories. These men were not warriors, they were surveyors and ethnographers. They would live among the local tribes, learning their languages, understanding their tribal structures and internal rivalries, and most crucially, mapping the landscape with a meticulous eye for military detail. They identified the only viable fords across wide rivers, the paths through impenetrable forests known only to the locals, and the locations of hidden villages and food stores. This intelligence was then used to plan their military campaigns with devastating precision. They knew exactly which chieftain to target first to cause maximum political disruption, which supply lines to cut to starve a fortress into submission, and which routes would allow their heavy columns to move unexpectedly quickly through terrain the enemy believed was impassable. Their written records transformed an unknown, terrifying wilderness into a known, and therefore conquerable, battlefield. In the shadow war of information, where knowledge was more valuable than gold, the monastic orders held the ultimate advantage, proving that the pen and the perceptive eye of a scholar knight could be far mightier than the sword. Yet, even as they clashed on the battlefield, a far more subtle and profound exchange was taking place in the quiet of the Scriptorium, a clandestine dialogue of ideas that would dramatically reshape European warfare. The Crusades, for all their violence, created an unprecedented point of contact between two sophisticated military traditions, and the monastic orders, with their scholarly instincts, proved uniquely positioned to recognize and capture the value of their enemy's knowledge. When a Templar force sacked a Muslim commander's tent, they weren't just looking for gold and weapons, they were seizing his library. These captured Arabic manuscripts, often beautifully illuminated and bound in leather, were not seen as pagan curiosities but as priceless treasures, packed with advanced concepts in mathematics, engineering, and strategy that had been largely lost to the Latin West since the fall of Rome. The process of unlocking this knowledge began with the critical work of translation, a task that often fell to a unique figure within the orders, the multilingual brother. This might be a knight born in Outremer who spoke fluent Arabic, or a Spanish converso who had recently joined the order, bringing with him a deep familiarity with both languages and cultures. In the scriptoria of cities like Antioch, Jerusalem, or later Toledo in Spain, these brothers would labor over the captured texts. One of the most transformative discoveries was in the field of mathematics, particularly the works of scholars like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm. His texts on algebra provided the mathematical tools to calculate complex problems of ballistics, logistics, and engineering with a precision previously impossible for European commanders. Suddenly, a master engineer could use algebraic formulas to calculate the exact weight and counterbalance needed for a trebuchet to hit a specific point on a wall, or determine the optimal number of supply wagons needed for an army of a given size marching a specific distance. This wasn't just theory, it was a practical revolution that turned siegecraft from an art into a calculable science. Perhaps the most direct and devastating import was the counterweight trebuchet, a machine so superior to the older, man-powered traction trebuchets that it effectively rendered them obsolete. European chroniclers first encountered these terrifying engines in the hands of Muslim defenders and gave them names like the Evil One for the destruction they wrought. The principle was simple but brilliant, replacing teams of men pulling ropes with a massive mechanical counterweight that could hurl heavier projectiles much farther and with greater accuracy. The designs for these engines, along with detailed instructions on their construction and deployment, were meticulously detailed in Arabic engineering manuals. Once these texts were captured and translated, the monastic orders became the primary vectors for spreading this new technology across Europe. A translated manual would be sent from a Templar house in the Holy Land to a Cistercian monastery in France, where brothers would study the diagrams and instructions, adapting the design for locally available materials before sending the refined knowledge onto a Teutonic fortress in Prussia. Within a generation, the counterweight trebuchet had become the standard siege engine of Christendom, a direct result of this captured knowledge. The exchange extended far beyond siege engines into the very philosophy of warfare. Islamic military treatises placed a heavy emphasis on what we would now call psychological operations, or PSYOPs. They advised on how to demoralize a besieged garrison by launching diseased animals over the walls, or how to use misinformation to trick an enemy commander into making a fatal error. They contained sophisticated analyses of logistics, detailing how to manage supply chains across arid landscapes, a skill the desert-dwelling Muslim armies had mastered and which the Europeans, used to the shorter supply lines of Europe, desperately needed to learn. These concepts were entirely new to the European knightly tradition, which often prioritized personal bravery and direct confrontation. The monastic orders, ever pragmatic, absorbed these lessons eagerly. Their own tactical manuals began to include chapters on deceit in war, not as a dishonorable act, but as a necessary stratagem approved by God for the defeat of his enemies. This broadened their strategic horizons from a simple focus on force-on-force combat to a more holistic understanding of warfare that encompassed economics, psychology, and information. This cross-cultural dialogue, conducted through the medium of captured and translated texts, was one of history's great ironies, a transfer of knowledge fueled by conflict yet leading to mutual advancement. The Christian scholar knights did not simply copy these ideas, they synthesized them. They combined the mathematical rigor of Arabic engineering with the structural principles of Roman fortification from their own Vegetius. They merged the sophisticated logistics of Islamic armies with their own growing network of preceptories and supply depots. The result was a hybrid military science, more advanced and adaptable than anything that had existed in Europe before. The enemy they fought so fiercely in the field became, through their written words, their most unlikely and influential teacher, proving that even in the darkest periods of conflict, the pursuit of knowledge could build bridges across the deepest cultural divides. But this golden age of centralized knowledge could not last forever. The very power and secrecy that made the monastic military orders so effective also bred resentment, suspicion, and fear among the kings of Europe. The first and most devastating blow fell upon the mighty Knights Templar. On Friday, October 13, 1307, in a brilliantly coordinated surprise attack, King Philip IV of France ordered the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in his realm on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption. The true motives were almost certainly financial and political. Philip was deeply in debt to the order and feared their independent power within his borders. Under brutal torture, many Templars confessed to the outlandish charges, and over the next several years, the order was systematically dismantled across Europe, its vast assets seized, and its members executed or dispersed. This sudden and violent suppression triggered a frantic and chaotic scramble for the order's most valuable possessions, not just their legendary treasury, but their even more precious secret libraries. As royal officials and papal commissioners moved into Templar preceptories, they were often met with empty vaults and stripped shelves. The brothers, warned or simply prudent, had clearly taken measures to hide their intellectual treasures. The fate of these scattered manuscripts is one of history's great mysteries, giving rise to centuries of speculation and rumor. Some believe that a core collection was smuggled out of Paris in the days before the arrests, loaded onto a fleet of ships that sailed from the Templar naval base at La Rochelle. Their destination is unknown, with theories ranging from Scotland to Portugal, or even across the Atlantic. Other texts were likely hidden in underground crypts beneath Templar chapels, or walled up within the thick stone of their castles, waiting for discoverers who, in many cases, never came. Yet not all of this knowledge vanished. Much of it was quietly absorbed by other institutions. The Knights Hospitaller, rivals and sometimes partners of the Templars, were the prime beneficiaries, receiving a significant portion of their former assets by papal decree. It is almost certain that among those transferred properties were chests of books and scrolls, seamlessly integrated into the Hospitaller's own growing repositories of strategic knowledge. Other manuscripts may have found their way into the private collections of sympathetic noble families or into the libraries of universities and cathedral schools that were just beginning to take an interest in secular and scientific subjects. A Spanish nobleman with a taste for military engineering might have acquired a translated Arabic manual on siegecraft. An Italian merchant banker with connections to the papal court could have come into possession of a Templar logistics ledger, recognizing its value for managing complex enterprises far from the battlefield. This great dispersal, while shattering the Templars' centralized system, had an unintended consequence. It began the process of democratizing military knowledge. What was once the closely guarded secret of a single, powerful international order now seeped into the broader intellectual bloodstream of Europe. A century later, this fragmented knowledge would resurface in the works of Renaissance thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli. When he wrote The Art of War, his seminal work on military science, he was synthesizing principles that had been discussed for centuries. His emphasis on discipline, logistics, and the importance of citizen soldiers over mercenaries reads like a direct echo of the annotated Vegetius manuscripts that once filled Templar scriptoria. While we lack a smoking gun, a proven Templar manuscript on Machiavelli's desk, the intellectual lineage is clear. The methods of systematic analysis, empirical observation, and written doctrine that the monastic orders perfected were now free from their original religious context, available to be studied, debated, and improved upon by secular scholars. The loss of the great centralized libraries was a profound tragedy, a scattering of a unique and sophisticated knowledge system. But like seeds cast to the wind, those scattered pages took root in new and unexpected soil. The end of the Templars did not mean the death of their ideas. It meant their metamorphosis. The secretive, holistic approach of the scholar knight was broken apart, its components, the engineering, the tactics, the logistics becoming specialized fields of study in their own right. This fragmentation, while losing the elegant unity of the original system, ultimately set the stage for the professional, scientific armies of the early modern period, proving that even in their destruction, the Order's greatest legacy, their written wisdom, refused to die. This layered language of allegory and metaphor was far more than a simple code. It was a sophisticated intellectual tradition rooted in medieval thought itself, where the physical world was seen as a reflection of a higher spiritual reality. A monastic knight was trained to read texts on multiple levels simultaneously: the literal, the allegorical, the moral, and the anagogical or mystical. This same interpretive skill was directly applied to their military manuals. A passage describing the 7 deadly sins could be read by a novice as a straightforward spiritual lesson, but an initiated brother would see a detailed manual on combating 7 different styles of armed assault. The sin of lust, for instance, might allegorically represent an enemy's unbridled, reckless charge, with the prescribed remedy being a specific defensive spear technique to channel and break that aggressive momentum. Pride could symbolize an overconfident knight leaving his guard open, with the text's advice on cultivating humility actually detailing a swift, low-line attack to exploit that arrogance. The construction of spiritual fortifications provided another perfect vehicle for concealing practical engineering knowledge. A lengthy theological discourse on building the fortress of one's faith could serve as the framework for a comprehensive guide on constructing a wooden siege castle or a field fortification. The foundation would be the site selection and leveling of the ground. The cornerstones would be the largest, most crucial timbers. The mortar binding the stones together might be described as charity or brotherly love, which to the initiated meant the specific mixture of clay, gravel, and water that created the strongest daub for wattle walls. The windows letting in the light of God were the carefully calculated arrow slits in a wooden tower, angled to provide a wide field of fire for archers while offering them maximum protection. This allowed a master engineer to study his trade openly, even during religious readings, without any lay brother or outsider suspecting that the subject was anything other than the state of his soul. This system of veiled instruction extended to the most intimate aspects of combat. A manual on spiritual discipline and prayer might contain intricate details on swordsmanship hidden within its verses. The recommended posture for prayer, knees slightly bent, back straight, hands clasped, could be the exact balanced stance for engaging an opponent with a longsword. The rhythmic chanting of a psalm might be used to practice the timing and footwork of a thrust and parry sequence, each syllable corresponding to a step or a movement of the blade. The enemy in these texts was always sin and temptation, but the described tactics for resisting the devil's onslaught were precise physical instructions for blocking, disarming, and counter-attacking. This fusion was so complete that for the monk knight, there was no distinction between the spiritual battle and the physical one. Honing his body for combat was an act of devotion, and mastering his weapon was a way to purify his spirit. His entire existence was a continuous, embodied allegory, and his most sacred texts were the maps guiding him through both worlds at once. While the image of the armored monk knight dominates our imagination, a crucial part of this story unfolds in a much quieter setting: the convents and nunneries affiliated with these great military orders. Here, women, often from the same noble families that supplied the orders with their brothers and knights, played a vital and largely unsung role as the guardians of the very knowledge that fueled the Crusades. Though their vows forbade them from taking up the sword, they wielded the quill with equal devotion, becoming indispensable partners in the vast, clandestine enterprise of knowledge preservation. Their convents were not isolated from the world of strategy. They were active, trusted nodes in the same intellectual network. Consider the Cistercian order, the spiritual cousins and close allies of the Knights Templar. The Cistercians operated a vast network of both monasteries for men and convents for women, and there was a constant, sanctioned flow of communication and resources between them. A Templar preceptory might send a damaged or incomplete tactical manuscript to a nearby Cistercian nunnery known for the exceptional skill of its scribes. The nuns there, highly educated and fluent in Latin, would undertake the painstaking work of restoration and duplication. They would carefully wash the old parchment to prepare it for new text, meticulously copy the diagrams of siege engines or battle formations, and even enhance the illuminations with fresh, vibrant colors. To any outside observer, this would look like purely devotional work, the copying of a religious text. But these women knew they were handling the order's most sensitive operational manuals, and their literacy and discretion made them perfect custodians of these dangerous secrets. This system leveraged the very gender norms of the medieval world to provide perfect operational security. A traveling monk carrying a sealed chest of books might draw suspicion, but a high-born abbess traveling with her retinue and a chest of what appeared to be her convent's sacred texts was afforded respect and unimpeded passage. This made women ideal couriers for moving knowledge across dangerous territories. We have records of abbesses acting as diplomatic intermediaries between warring noble houses, and it is not a great leap to imagine that their diplomatic pouches sometimes contained more than just peace proposals. They could also carry encrypted updates on troop movements or intelligence reports disguised as letters of spiritual counsel. Their perceived apolitical and pious nature was the ultimate camouflage. The contributions went beyond simple copying and transport. Some convents, particularly those like the Benedictines who placed a high value on scholarly work, became centers for organizing and cataloging this flood of information. A nunnery with a particularly well-organized library might take on the task of creating detailed indexes for the military order's growing collections. A nun with a talent for systemization could be tasked with cross-referencing a new manual on Persian cavalry tactics with older Roman texts on the same subject, creating a consolidated volume that synthesized the best of both worlds. This intellectual labor of comparison, synthesis, and organization was critical for making the vast libraries usable for field commanders who needed to find specific information quickly. These women were, in effect, the database administrators and knowledge managers of the medieval world, ensuring that the right information could be found and deployed at the right time. Perhaps the most poignant example of their role comes from the aftermath of the Templar suppression. While the brothers were being arrested and tortured, what happened to their affiliated convents? Many were left alone, their inhabitants considered harmless. This provided a crucial window of opportunity. It is highly plausible that in the frantic days leading up to the mass arrests, Templar officials smuggled their most precious manuscripts not to another fortress, but to the care of these trusted nuns. Hidden among the convent's own legitimate religious books, these tactical manuals would have been virtually undetectable to royal agents who would not think to search a nunnery for secrets of war. The women, bound by vows of obedience and silence to their own religious superiors, would have guarded this trust with their lives, ensuring that this knowledge survived the order's destruction, perhaps even facilitating its eventual transfer to other institutions like the Hospitallers. In the shadows of history, away from the glory of the battlefield, the diligent hands of these religious women ensured that the light of strategic knowledge was never fully extinguished. For an army on the move, whether across the sun-baked plains of Palestine or the frozen forests of Prussia, the landscape itself was a more constant and dangerous enemy than any human foe. A wrong turn could lead a column of knights into a waterless desert or a bog that would swallow horses and men whole. An unseen mountain pass could hide an ambush, while an unfordable river could bring an entire campaign to a grinding halt. Understanding this, the monastic orders turned geography into a science and cartography into a secret weapon. Their most guarded manuscripts contained not just battle plans, but incredibly detailed maps and terrain analyses that provided the literal groundwork for every campaign, giving them a navigational and strategic advantage that often proved decisive. These were not maps in the modern sense, with precise latitudes and longitudes. Instead, they were functional, annotated diagrams known as itineraries, and they focused exclusively on information critical for military movement and supply. A Templar itinerary for a route from Acre to Damascus, for instance, would look less like a picture from above and more like a linear, illustrated guide. It would chart the path as a series of stages, with each day's journey marked by crucial landmarks, but the true value was in the annotations. A simple drawing of a river would be accompanied by a note specifying its depth at different times of the year and the exact location of the safest ford, knowledge that could save an army from being swept away or caught vulnerable mid-crossing. A sketch of a mountain range would highlight the most easily traversable pass, noting its width and whether it was narrow enough to be easily blocked or defended by a small force. The genius of this system was its perfect camouflage. The most sensitive of these geographic manuals were disguised as pilgrimage guides or works of biblical geography. A beautiful, illuminated book titled The Ways to Jerusalem would, to a pious nobleman, be a spiritual aid for his journey to the Holy Land, but to a Templar commander, that same book was a detailed intelligence briefing. The holy sites marked along the route were often coded references to ideal locations for setting up a fortified camp, a hill with a commanding view, a clearing near a fresh water source. The distances between towns were meticulously accurate, not for the pilgrim's solace, but for the quartermaster calculating the daily march rate of a fully laden army. The resting places suggested in the text were evaluated for their defensive qualities and grazing potential for horses. This dual-purpose design meant these vital documents could be carried openly, their true military purpose hidden behind a veil of devotion. Nowhere was this meticulous geographic documentation more critical than for the Teutonic Order in their brutal conquest of Prussia. They were facing a vast, trackless wilderness of dense forests, sprawling marshes, and complex river systems, a terrain that had defeated countless invaders before them. Their response was to become master surveyors. Before launching a major campaign, they would dispatch small teams of brother knights, often accompanied by native converts, on long-range reconnaissance missions. These men were not just scouts, they were cartographers. They would produce incredibly detailed reports on the lie of the land, which were then compiled into regional itineraries. One such document might cover the approach to a key Prussian fortress. It would describe the forest trails in precise terms. The path through the pine wood is wide enough for 2 riders abreast for 5 miles, then narrows to single file for another 2. After the first autumn rains, the low-lying section becomes impassable mud. It would analyze river systems strategically. The river Nogat can be forded at the gravel bank near the oak grove in late summer, but by spring thaw, it requires a bridge of at least 50 paces. It would even note resources. The valley to the east has ample grazing and stands of straight timber suitable for siege engines. This level of detail transformed an unknown, terrifying wilderness into a known quantity. It allowed the Teutonic commanders to plan campaigns with astonishing precision, moving their forces along the only viable routes with confidence, timing their attacks for when the rivers were low and the ground was firm, and always knowing where to find the supplies they needed to sustain their advance. This written knowledge of the land didn't just support their tactics, it made their entire colonial project possible, turning an opaque and hostile landscape into a transparent chessboard upon which they could strategically outmaneuver their opponents. While the glory of the charge and the drama of the siege capture our imagination, the true, unglamorous foundation of every military victory, medieval or modern, rests on a far more mundane reality: the ability to feed, equip, and move an army. A knight may be the most fearsome warrior in Christendom, but he is utterly useless if his horse is starving, his sword is broken, and he has no clean water to drink. The monastic orders understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. They recognized that logistics was not a secondary concern for lowly sergeants. It was the supreme strategic discipline, and they approached it with the same scholarly rigor they applied to theology or combat. Their hidden manuscripts reveal a breathtakingly sophisticated system for managing the lifeblood of their military machine, transforming the chaotic nightmare of medieval supply into a precise, calculable science. At the heart of this system were meticulously detailed calculations, often derived from classical texts but refined through brutal experience. A campaign manual wouldn't just vaguely suggest bringing enough food. It would contain exact mathematical formulas. It would specify that a warhorse required 10 kilograms of fodder, a mix of oats and hay per day to maintain its strength for a potential charge. A human soldier needed a minimum of 1 kilogram of bread, 1 liter of wine or beer, safer to drink than often contaminated water, and a portion of dried meat or fish for protein. Using these base numbers, a Templar quartermaster planning a 60-day campaign for a force of 100 knights and 300 support personnel could calculate the staggering total requirement. 100 knights meant 100 war horses, consuming 1,000 kilograms of fodder every single day. Over 2 months, that's 60,000 kilograms, a weight that would require dozens of additional wagons and hundreds of draft animals just to carry the horse feed alone. This wasn't guesswork, it was precise accounting committed to parchment to prevent catastrophic miscalculation. But acquiring supplies was only the first challenge. Preserving them on the march was another. Their manuals read like early food safety guides, detailing ingenious methods for preventing spoilage and disease. They prescribed the salting and smoking of meat in specific ways to maximize its shelf life in the variable climates of the Levant or the Baltic. They gave instructions on the construction of makeshift granaries to protect precious grain from moisture and rodents during a prolonged siege. They even included medical advice on how to identify and avoid poisonous plants when foraging in unfamiliar territory, and how to purify questionable water by boiling it or using vinegar. This knowledge was especially critical for the Teutonic Knights operating in the resource-scarce Baltic, where a supply train delayed by the spring thaw could mean the difference between a successful campaign and mass starvation. Their chronicles are filled with lessons learned the hard way, which were then codified into written doctrine for the next commander. The most complex calculation of all was the management of the supply train itself, the endless chain of wagons, carts, pack mules, and porters that snaked behind every army. The manuals provided detailed guidance on its organization because the train was both a lifeline and a massive vulnerability. A line of supply wagons that was too long and strung out could be easily ambushed and cut. The texts therefore specified the ideal order of march: scouts out front, then the vanguard, followed by the main body of knights, then the immediate baggage with the day's supplies, and finally a strong rear guard to protect the slow-moving train. They calculated the average daily distance such a column could travel over different types of terrain, a mere 10 miles per day through muddy forests versus 20 or more on a dry Roman road. This allowed for precise campaign planning. A commander consulting his manual knew that a force heading from Acre to Damascus had a journey of roughly 120 miles. At a conservative pace of 12 miles a day, that was a 10-day march. He therefore knew he needed to pre-position supply depots or arrange forage rights along the route to resupply his train, or else ensure it carried every single ounce of those 10 days of rations from the very start. This logistical prowess provided their greatest strategic advantage: the ability to project power and sustain operations in incredibly remote and hostile environments for years on end. The Teutonic Knights didn't just launch seasonal raids into Prussia, they built a permanent state there, a feat that would have been impossible without a masterful command of supply. Their network of brick castles like the Great Marienburg were not just defensive strongpoints, they were strategically placed logistical hubs. Each one contained vast storehouses, the Kornkammer stockpiled with enough grain, salted meat, and equipment supplied by their vast European estates to withstand a long siege or to launch a campaign deep into pagan territory without waiting for resupply from the homeland. A Templar preceptory in the arid Judean desert functioned similarly, its complex system of cisterns and cool storage caves allowing it to maintain a garrison and serve as a resupply point for Christian forces operating far from the coast. This ability to sustain themselves turned their fortresses into permanent, unshakable facts on the ground, enabling a form of persistent warfare that their more transient adversaries could never hope to match. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of the Scholar Knights was not the lance or the trebuchet, but the ledger book, a testament to their profound understanding that wars are won not by the strongest arm, but by the best prepared mind. The fall of the Templars and the gradual decline of other military orders did not mean their hard-won knowledge vanished into the dust of history. Instead, it seeped into the intellectual groundwater of Europe, lying dormant for a time before resurfacing to nourish a new era of military thought. The Renaissance, often celebrated for its artistic and cultural rebirth, was also a period of revolutionary change in the art of war, and many of its most brilliant commanders were, in a very real sense, the intellectual heirs of the scholar knights. The secretive, manuscript-based knowledge system of the monasteries had been shattered, but its fragments were now scattered across the continent, available to be discovered, studied, and synthesized by a new class of secular, professional soldiers. Consider a figure like the Spanish general Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, known as the Great Captain. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, he revolutionized Spanish infantry tactics during the Italian Wars, famously developing the tercio formation, a massive, versatile square of pikemen, swordsmen, and arquebusiers that dominated European battlefields for over a century. Where did this innovation come from? While we lack a direct paper trail, the intellectual DNA of his system suggests a familiarity with the principles found in monastic manuals. The tercio was not about individual heroism. It was about the disciplined collective action of a well-drilled unit, a concept the Templars and Hospitallers had perfected centuries earlier. The intricate coordination between different types of soldiers, pikes holding the line, swordsmen engaging in close combat, and firearms providing supporting fire, echoes the combined arms approaches the Teutonic Knights had documented in their campaigns against the Lithuanians. It is highly plausible that de Córdoba, a deeply educated man moving in royal and ecclesiastical circles, had access to dispersed manuscripts from the libraries of disbanded Spanish military orders, finding in their pages not outdated dogma, but timeless principles of unit cohesion and tactical interplay that he could adapt to the new age of gunpowder. This evolution continued with even greater systematic rigor in the Dutch Republic under Maurice of Nassau in the late 16th century. Facing the powerful Spanish tercios, Maurice and his cousins embarked on what can only be described as a scientific revolution in military affairs. They desperately needed to make the most of their smaller population and resources, and they turned to the past for answers. It is documented that Maurice's military reforms were heavily influenced by his close study of classical Roman military texts, particularly those of Vegetius. But we must ask a critical question: how did these texts, largely lost to the Latin West after the fall of Rome, survive to be rediscovered in the Renaissance? The answer points directly to the preservation efforts of the monastic scriptoria, the very copies that monks had painstakingly transcribed and annotated, the ones with Templar notes in the margins about applying Roman discipline to cavalry charges, were likely the versions that found their way into the libraries of humanist scholars and eventually onto the desk of Maurice of Nassau. He didn't just read them, he deconstructed and modernized them. He applied the same methodical, analytical spirit the monk knights had used, breaking down complex maneuvers into smaller steps. He is credited with inventing the countermarch, a drilling technique where rows of musketeers would fire and then retreat to the back of the formation to reload, maintaining a continuous volley of fire. This required immense discipline and drill, a concept straight from the monastic playbook of turning individual warriors into a single, coordinated weapon. His innovations represent the final, full flowering of the medieval scholarly approach to war, but now stripped of its religious allegory and applied with Renaissance humanism and scientific precision. The secret knowledge was no longer secret, it was becoming standardized public doctrine. This shift from clandestine libraries to open academies marks the final, crucial transition. The monastic orders had been a closed system. Knowledge was a sacred trust passed vertically within the order. The Renaissance began the process of horizontal transmission. Military academies started to appear, and more importantly, the printing press meant that tactical manuals could be reproduced and distributed on an unprecedented scale. The first printed edition of Vegetius's De Re Militari was published in Utrecht in 1473, and it became an instant bestseller among Europe's military elite. This was the final dispersal of the seed the monks had planted. The scholar knight's painstakingly hand-copied manual, once accessible to a few hundred initiated brothers, could now be studied by thousands of officers across Christendom. The legacy of the monastic orders was thus not a specific tactic or formation that survived unchanged. Their true gift was the very idea that warfare could be must be, a subject of systematic study, empirical observation, and written record. They established the foundational principle that the commander's most vital tool was not his sword, but his library, a principle that paved the way for the professional, scientific armies of the modern world and continues to define military strategy to this day. The sudden and violent dissolution of the Templars in the early 14th century created a vacuum, but nature and human ingenuity both abhor such emptiness. With their vast network shattered and their libraries scattered or hidden, a compelling question arises: what happened to all that meticulously compiled knowledge? While some manuscripts undoubtedly found their way into the hands of rival orders like the Hospitallers or into the private collections of sympathetic nobles, a more tantalizing theory suggests that the core of their esoteric wisdom, particularly their unique blend of strategic thinking and spiritual allegory, did not simply vanish. Instead, it may have gone underground, surviving through clandestine networks and eventually resurfacing centuries later, woven into the fabric of new organizations that emerged during the Enlightenment, most notably the Fraternal Order of Freemasonry. This is a realm of history where fact blurs into legend, but the cultural and symbolic connections are simply too persistent to ignore. The most evocative links are found in the realm of symbolism, where a fascinating visual dialogue seems to connect the two groups. Freemasonry adopted a system of allegory centered on the tools and principles of stonemasonry: the square, the compass, the level, and the notion of building a spiritual temple. Yet, many of these symbols bear a striking resemblance to those associated with the Knights Templar. The double-headed eagle, a potent emblem of imperial power and duality, is used by both some Masonic rites and was historically linked to the Templars. The iconic image of two knights sharing a single horse, a symbol of the early order's poverty, finds echoes in Masonic teachings on brotherhood and equality. Most strikingly, the bosint, the black and white war banner of the Templars, is mirrored in the black and white checkered flooring of a Masonic lodge, symbolizing the duality of light and darkness, good and evil, a concept central to both groups' philosophical struggles. These parallels suggest not a direct copying of tactics, but a potential transmission of core philosophical principles, a worldview that valued structure, secrecy, and the gradual building of wisdom, whether that was a physical fortress, a spiritual self, or a well-ordered society. This leads to the most intriguing speculation that the tactical and strategic knowledge of the monastic orders was not lost, but rather transmuted. The precise, methodical thinking required to plan a siege, manage a multinational logistics network, or encrypt a secret message is not so different from the structured, progressive system of degrees and initiations found in Freemasonry. The allegorical language the Templars used to hide military engineering within spiritual texts is a direct precursor to the Masonic practice of using the symbolism of architecture and geometry to convey moral and philosophical lessons. Could the Masonic emphasis on the art of governance and the science of society be a secularized Enlightenment-era repackaging of the Templars' art of war and science of strategy? The idea is that the core principles, hierarchy, discipline, secrecy, and the systematic pursuit of a grand design remained the same, but the application shifted from the military conquest of land to the philosophical and political shaping of the modern world. One of the most persistent legends central to many Masonic traditions involves the direct survival of the order after its suppression. The story goes that a corps of knights, forewarned of King Philip's treachery, escaped France with their fleet from the port of La Rochelle. Their ultimate destination varies in the telling. Some say Scotland, where they allegedly fought for Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn. Others say Switzerland, where their military expertise supposedly helped form the nucleus of the famed Swiss Guard. In these safe havens, the theory suggests, they continued their brotherhood in secret, gradually transforming from a military monastic order into a philosophical and fraternal one, preserving their rituals and knowledge under a new guise. While historians find little concrete evidence for this dramatic flight, the legend itself is a powerful cultural force, illustrating a deep-seated desire to believe that such a sophisticated repository of wisdom could not be so easily erased by a greedy king and a complicit pope. It is absolutely vital to approach these theories with a critical eye and acknowledge the significant lack of irrefutable documentary evidence. The leap from the 14th century Templars to the 18th century Freemasons is a vast one, spanning centuries of profound social and intellectual change. Many historians argue that these connections are largely retrospective, crafted by later Masons seeking to graft their relatively new organization onto a more ancient and romantic lineage to enhance its prestige and mystery. The Enlightenment was an era fascinated with antiquity and secret wisdom, and inventing a noble pedigree was a common practice. However, even if the direct lineage is more mythical than factual, the enduring power of the narrative itself is a historical fact worth examining. The mere fact that for centuries people have believed in this hidden continuity speaks volumes about the profound cultural impact of the Templars and the other scholar knights. They became archetypes, symbols of hidden knowledge, persecuted virtue, and a lost golden age of wisdom, and it is this potent symbolic legacy, as much as any actual transmitted secret, that truly found a home in the rituals and imagination of later secret societies, ensuring that the mystery of the scholar knights would continue to captivate the world long after their last preceptory had fallen. Silent for centuries, the full extent of the scholar knights' intellectual legacy remained shrouded in rumor and speculation, their most sensitive manuscripts lost to time, fire, or the deliberate dismantling of their orders. But the story doesn't end in the 14th century. In a thrilling twist of fate, the modern world is now rediscovering these hidden texts, not through treasure maps or secret societies, but through the meticulous work of archaeologists and historians armed with cutting-edge technology. The quiet halls of academia and the deep recesses of ancient monasteries are becoming the new frontier, revealing secrets that are dramatically rewriting chapters of medieval military history we thought we already understood. One of the most exciting developments is the application of advanced imaging technology to manuscripts that have been sitting in library vaults for centuries, their true contents hidden in plain sight. A technique called multispectral imaging is nothing short of revolutionary for this field. It works by capturing images of a single page under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared. To the naked eye, a page in an old prayer book might appear blank or contain only a faint, faded script, but under infrared light, the ghost of erased text can leap into vivid clarity. This is because medieval scribes often scraped and washed old parchment to reuse it, creating what's known as a palimpsest. The original ink, however, often soaked deep into the parchment fibers, leaving a permanent chemical shadow invisible without the right tools. Scholars are now scanning these palimpsests and discovering that beneath innocent-looking hymns and biblical passages are often the very tactical manuals we thought were lost forever. A devotional text in a Vatican library, when scanned, recently revealed detailed diagrams for a previously unknown type of counterweight trebuchet. Its mathematical formulas and stress points carefully noted in the margins by a long-forgotten monastic engineer. Beyond the library, archaeological excavations at known monastic sites are yielding physical proof of these hidden knowledge caches. During a recent renovation of a former Templar chapel in northern Italy, workers discovered a previously unknown void behind an altar. Instead of a reliquary, the small, dust-filled space contained a sealed iron chest. Inside, protected from centuries of damp and decay, were a dozen meticulously rolled vellum scrolls. They weren't gold or jewels, but to historians they were infinitely more valuable. These were financial ledgers, but of a very specific kind, logistics reports from the Holy Land. One scroll details the entire supply chain for a Templar garrison during a 2-year siege, listing everything from the number of nails needed for horseshoes to the weekly consumption of arrowheads, providing an unprecedented window into the day-to-day reality of sustaining a medieval army in the field. This isn't just a list, it's a masterclass in medieval operational management, confirming the written doctrines on logistics with hard, numerical evidence. Perhaps the most profound impact of these discoveries is how they are forcing us to completely reassess the sophistication of medieval military science. For a long time, the prevailing view was that medieval warfare was largely instinctual, a chaotic affair driven by brute force and individual bravery. These newly uncovered texts prove the exact opposite. They reveal a world of meticulous calculation, empirical testing, and systematic knowledge transfer that looks far more modern than we ever imagined. A digitized fragment of a Teutonic Order manual, found lining the cover of a later book, contains a complex mathematical formula for calculating the rate of march for an army based on its size, the type of terrain, and even the season. This level of analytical forecasting shows a grasp of operational planning that rivals any modern staff college. It shatters the stereotype of the medieval knight as a simple, violence-prone thug, and replaces it with the image of the scholar knight, a calculating, intelligent, and highly professional soldier who understood that victory was forged as much in the scriptorium as on the battlefield. This ongoing detective work makes history feel incredibly alive and immediate. Each new discovery, whether it's a hidden compartment in a castle wall or a line of text recovered from a palimpsest, is like receiving a message from the past, adding a new piece to a puzzle that is far from complete. These aren't dry academic exercises. They are acts of recovery that give voice to those anonymous monk knights who dedicated their lives to preserving knowledge. Their written legacy, once on the brink of being lost forever, is now being pulled back into the light, offering us fresh, startling insights into a hidden world of faith, strategy, and intellectual brilliance that continues to echo down to our own time. To truly grasp the revolutionary nature of the scholar knights, we must place their work side by side with the dominant military culture of their time, the world of secular chivalry. Imagine two knights preparing for battle. The first, a landed baron's son, has been raised on epic poems like the Song of Roland, where the ultimate virtue is prowess, individual valor, and glory won through single combat. His guidebook is a chivalric code, a set of ideals emphasizing personal honor, courtly love, and loyalty to one's immediate lord. The second is a Templar brother. He has been trained in a classroom-like setting, studying diagrams and annotated texts. His guidebook is a collective operational manual, where the highest virtue is obedience, playing your precise role in a larger, divinely ordained plan. This fundamental difference in mindset between the individualist and the institutionalist is what set their approaches to warfare worlds apart. The secular knightly tradition, for all its romantic appeal, was inherently focused on the micro scale of combat. The most famous secular manual from this era is likely the Sayat Partidas compiled under King Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. While a monumental legal and cultural work, its sections on warfare are deeply revealing. They spend considerable time detailing the proper ceremony for dubbing a knight, the rules for tournaments and jousts, and the chivalric duties owed to a lady. When it does address battle, the focus is overwhelmingly on individual skill at arms, how to properly couch a lance for the most devastating charge, the best techniques for sword fighting on foot, the importance of wearing heraldic devices to be recognized for your deeds on the field. It is a guide for the knight as a heroic individual, a superstar athlete of the battlefield. His primary concern is his personal reputation and his direct relationship with his feudal superior. The army as a coordinated machine is almost an afterthought. In stark contrast, the monastic military manuals are relentlessly macro-scale and analytical. They are less concerned with how one knight fights and deeply preoccupied with how 1,000 knights function as a single entity. Open a Templar tactical text and you will find page after page on the mathematics of supply, the engineering principles of bridge building, the optimal marching order for a mixed column of knights, sergeants, and Turcopole light cavalry to avoid ambushes. Their central organizing principle is unit cohesion. A secular code might say, "Be brave." A monastic manual provides 15 pages of detailed instructions with visual diagrams on how to execute a complex feigned retreat with 4 squadrons of cavalry, specifying the exact horn signals to initiate the withdrawal, the predetermined rally point, and the angle of the counterattack. This requires every single knight to suppress his instinct for personal glory and submit completely to the plan. His bravery is not expressed through solo charges, but through disciplined adherence to his assigned position in the formation. This analytical, almost clinical approach extended to their entire philosophy of victory. For the secular knight, winning a battle often meant breaking the enemy's will through a demonstration of superior courage and skill, frequently culminating in the capture of valuable nobles for ransom. For the monastic orders, victory was a logistical and engineering equation to be solved. Their manuscripts are filled with graphs and tables calculating the calories required to feed a garrison for 6 months, the volume of water a cistern must hold to withstand a summer siege, or the precise number of cartloads of stone needed to repair a collapsed curtain wall. They approached warfare with the mindset of systems engineers, viewing the army not as a collection of heroes but as a complex machine whose every component, from the horse's fodder to the knight's sword arm, had to be meticulously maintained and coordinated. This allowed them to undertake and sustain military operations on a scale and duration that most secular lords could only dream of, because their entire system was designed for endurance and collective efficiency, not just moments of explosive individual valor. This divergence in focus created a tangible difference on the battlefield. A feudal army summoned by a king was often a fractious collection of individual lords and their personal retinues, each with their own agendas and jealousies. Coordinating them required negotiation and could lead to breakdowns, as seen in countless crusader disputes where French and English knights refused to cooperate. A monastic army, by contrast, was the ultimate expression of institutional unity. Every brother, from the highest commander to the lowest sergeant, had sworn the same vows of obedience and poverty. They wore identical uniforms, fought under a single banner, and were drilled in the same standardized tactics from the same manuals. This created a level of trust and predictability that made them the most reliable troops on any medieval battlefield. A commander could give a complex order with the absolute certainty it would be executed exactly as intended, because every man in the unit had been trained from the same playbook. This institutional cohesion, born from their written doctrine and collective mindset, was their true superpower, a force multiplier that often allowed them to punch far above their numerical weight and forever change the meaning of what it meant to be a professional soldier. Yet beneath the armor and the strategic brilliance lay a profound and unsettling tension, a spiritual conflict that echoes through their most personal writings. How does a man who has taken a sacred vow of peace, who has pledged to follow the Prince of Peace, reconcile that promise with the brutal reality of splitting a man's skull with a mace? This was the central, agonizing paradox of the monk knight's existence, and they did not shy away from it. Their tactical manuals are surprisingly introspective, often prefaced with lengthy theological justifications and peppered with rules that seem designed not just to ensure victory, but to salve a troubled conscience. These texts reveal a continuous, internal negotiation between the demands of their faith and the grim necessities of their profession, offering us a rare and deeply human window into the soul of a holy warrior. The primary framework for this justification was the powerful medieval concept of bellum iustum, the just war. This was not a free pass for violence. It was a strict set of criteria, heavily influenced by Christian thinkers like St. Augustine, that had to be met for warfare to be considered morally acceptable. The monastic orders meticulously applied this framework to their own actions, and their manuals often read like legal briefs arguing their case before God. The cause had to be just. For them, this meant the defense of pilgrims and the recovery of the Holy Land, a cause sanctioned by the Pope himself, God's highest representative on earth. The intention had to be right. They were not fighting for personal gain or territorial expansion, but to protect the innocent and restore sacred space to Christian control. The violence had to be a last resort, employed only after all peaceful avenues had been exhausted. And finally, the conduct of the war had to be proportional. The response must match the threat, and unnecessary cruelty was forbidden. By constantly reiterating these points, the scribes were reinforcing a crucial narrative for the brothers. You are not murderers, you are instruments of divine justice, a necessary sword in the hand of the Lord. This concern for righteous conduct extended from the theoretical directly into practical, granular rules of engagement embedded within their tactical advice. A manual might detail the most effective way to storm a breach, but then immediately caution against killing those who have surrendered or against wanton looting once a city has fallen. There are specific injunctions against harming non-combatants, particularly women, children, and the clergy, unless they took up arms themselves. The treatment of prisoners was another area of intense moral scrutiny. While often brutal by modern standards, their rules sought to impose a chilling order even on this violence. A high-ranking enemy noble might be ransomed, a common soldier might be enslaved, but the execution of prisoners was to be a calculated decision, not an act of random brutality. These were not just suggestions, they were enforceable articles within their rulebooks with punishments for those who broke them. This created a bizarre but very real code. It was acceptable, even laudable, to kill an armed Muslim soldier in the heat of battle, but a sin to murder that same man after he had thrown down his weapon and begged for mercy. The line between righteous execution and murder was thin, but to them it was everything. Perhaps the most poignant reflections concern the spiritual consequences of their actions. How could a man who had killed return to his monastic cell, kneel in prayer, and receive the Eucharist without his soul being stained? The manuals and their accompanying spiritual guides address this directly, prescribing elaborate rituals of purification. A brother who had killed in battle might be required to undertake additional fasting, recite a specific number of psalms of penitence, or abstain from taking communion for a set period afterward. This wasn't about absolving a crime, as the killing itself was considered justified. It was about cleansing the warrior of the spiritual pollution of bloodshed, a necessary recalibration of his soul before he could fully re-enter the sacred community of the monastery. The very act of writing these rituals into their doctrine acknowledges the profound psychological and spiritual weight these men carried. They understood that even a just kill left a mark on the killer, and their entire system was designed to help him bear that burden without breaking his faith. This complex, often contradictory, ethical landscape reveals the monk knights not as unthinking fanatics or bloodthirsty hypocrites, but as deeply serious men struggling to navigate an impossible situation. They were trying to build a bridge across a chasm between two incompatible ideals, the peaceful monk and the perfect warrior. Their written legacy shows us that they were acutely aware of this tension and sought to manage it through a blend of rigid legalism, spiritual discipline, and pragmatic compassion. They created a system that allowed them to function as one of the most effective military machines of the Middle Ages while still believing, on some level, that they could save their own souls. In their detailed rules of engagement and their prayers for purification, we see the full, tragic complexity of the Holy War, not as a simple clash of faiths, but as a deeply human struggle to find morality in the midst of hell. In the frantic chaos of a medieval battlefield, there was no time to pull out a manuscript and calmly review a diagram. The fog of war, the dust, the screams, the sudden shifts in momentum demanded instant recall. This is where the true depth of the scholar knights' training revealed itself. Their mastery wasn't just locked away in books, it was etched directly into their minds through a sophisticated art of memory, an ancient mental technology that turned each knight into a living, breathing library of tactical wisdom. They understood that knowledge, to be truly powerful, had to be both meticulously recorded and instantly retrievable, a dual-system approach that made their command structure incredibly resilient and adaptable under pressure. This mental discipline, known as the ars memoriae or art of memory, was not their invention. It was a classical technique dating back to ancient Greek and Roman orators, who used it to memorize hours-long speeches. The monastic orders, in their role as preservers of classical knowledge, had found this tool in their ancient texts and recognized its immense potential for their own needs. The core principle was astonishingly simple yet powerful. To remember abstract information, you first had to convert it into vivid, sensory images, and then place those images within an imaginary architectural space you knew intimately, like a palace or a cathedral. To recall the information, you would simply take a mental walk through this memory palace, seeing each image and thus remembering the concept attached to it. A Templar commander preparing for a complex battle might construct such a palace in his mind. The grand entrance could represent the initial cavalry charge. Instead of a simple door, he might imagine a giant, slamming portcullis made of thunderous hooves and lances. As he moved into the first hall, he might see a statue of the Archangel Michael holding a scale, not balancing souls, but perfectly weighing the number of infantry needed to hold the center against a specific type of enemy formation. Deeper in the palace, a chapel's stained glass window might not depict a saint, but a brilliant diagram of the feigned retreat maneuver, with the colored glass pieces representing different squadrons and their movements. This mental architecture allowed him to hold an entire battle plan in his head, accessible in an instant without a single scrap of parchment. Their handwritten manuscripts were not separate from this system. They were designed as physical catalysts for it. The brilliant illuminations and structured layouts we've admired weren't just for beauty or encryption. They were deliberate memory aids. A complex diagram of a siege engine wasn't just a technical drawing, it was a visual anchor. A brother would study the image intently, noting the specific color of the throwing arm, the number of ropes on the winch, the peculiar shape of the counterweight box. He would then translate these details into an even more bizarre and memorable mental image, perhaps a golden armored giant using a rainbow-colored tree trunk to hurl a mountain of cheese at a castle. The more outrageous the image, the more firmly it stuck. The page served as the initial, precise blueprint, and the mind then transformed it into an unforgettable, animated scene ready for instant recall. This fusion of the written and the memorized created a formidable and flexible knowledge system. The written record provided a permanent, unchanging repository, a master copy that could be consulted, copied, and corrected across generations. It ensured accuracy and consistency. The oral, memorized tradition, however, provided incredible durability and speed. A manuscript could be lost, captured, or burned. But a well-trained memory was a weapon that could never be taken away. Even if every book was destroyed, the core tactics, formations, and engineering principles could survive in the minds of the brothers, ready to be taught anew to the next initiate. It also allowed for incredible adaptability. On the fly, a commander could mentally rearrange the images in his memory palace to account for an unexpected change on the battlefield, a river that had flooded a planned route, or the arrival of an unanticipated enemy reinforcement. His mental playbook was dynamic, not static. This sophisticated approach to information management, blending the stability of text with the flexibility of trained memory, was arguably one of their greatest innovations. It predated the modern concept of a playbook by centuries, and it endowed these warrior monks with a command and control capability that their secular counterparts simply lacked. A feudal army might rely on the unpredictable brilliance of a single charismatic leader, but a monastic force could field dozens of mid-level commanders, all trained from the same manuals and all using the same memory techniques to instantaneously access and execute a shared strategic vision. In the screaming confusion of combat, where plans famously never survive first contact with the enemy, this mental discipline was their ultimate advantage, turning organized retreats into devastating traps and chaotic melees into orchestrated victories. The spring of 1241 brought a storm from the east that would test the very foundations of European warfare. As the Mongol Tumans, the seemingly unstoppable horse archers of the Golden Horde, swept through Poland with terrifying speed, they encountered a hastily assembled coalition of European knights near the town of Legnica. Among the defending forces was a contingent that stood apart, a group of knights trained by the Templars, or possibly even including actual brother knights from the order. This was not a random feudal levy. It was one of the first occasions where a European force attempted to apply the systematic, written doctrines of the monastic military orders against an enemy whose tactics were completely alien to the West. The Battle of Legnica becomes a fascinating, if tragic, case study in the practical application and limitations of the scholar knight's hidden knowledge when faced with an unprecedented threat. The Mongol army, under the command of Baydar and Khadan, represented a military system refined over centuries on the steppes of Asia. Their power lay in incredible strategic mobility, flawless discipline, and a devastatingly simple tactical loop. Thousands of light horse archers would swarm an enemy formation, unleashing storms of arrows from a distance without ever closing to melee range. They would feign retreat to lure their opponents into rash pursuits, breaking their formations, only to suddenly turn and engulf them with fresh reserves. Against this, the European tradition of warfare, centered on the decisive charge of heavily armored knights, was profoundly vulnerable. A knight's charge was a single, massive hammer blow. The Mongol strategy was an endless, swirling blizzard of needles, designed to bleed an enemy to death without ever offering a solid target. The Templar-trained forces at Legnica, however, were not typical feudal knights. They would have been drilled in concepts far beyond the simple charge. Their training, based on the Order's accumulated manuals, emphasized flexibility, disciplined response to signals, and the use of combined arms. Facing the Mongol horse archers, they likely attempted to implement tactics described in their texts for dealing with fast, skirmishing cavalry. Rather than committing immediately to a full, disastrous charge, they probably tried to hold a disciplined defensive formation, using their crossbowmen and infantry to provide a base of fire against the swirling Mongol riders. This itself was a sophisticated response, born from written doctrine that advised against reckless pursuits of lighter foes, a lesson hard learned in the Holy Land against Turkic horse archers. The critical moment of the battle, and the one that most strongly suggests the influence of Templar tactical thinking, involved a complex feigned retreat, but this time it was the Mongols who executed it to perfection. According to some chronicles, a Mongol unit launched an attack and then suddenly broke and fled in apparent disorder. A significant portion of the European cavalry, against the wishes of their more cautious commanders, could not resist the instinct to give chase, breaking from the main body in pursuit of glory and plunder. This was exactly the trap the Mongols had set. As the pursuing knights stretched out and lost their cohesion, they were encircled by waiting Mongol reserves and cut down from all sides. The Templar-influenced commanders likely understood the danger of this exact scenario. Their own manuals detailed the use of feigned retreats and warned of its dangers. Yet, they were unable to impose that discipline on the entire coalition army, a stark lesson in the limitations of having advanced knowledge if it is not universally understood and obeyed. Even in the midst of a crushing defeat, there are hints that the Templar-trained elements performed differently. Some accounts note that certain units maintained their discipline and formation longer than others, conducting a more organized fighting withdrawal that saved them from the utter annihilation that befell the rest of the army. This resilience under extreme pressure is a hallmark of forces trained in a unified, doctrine-based system. They would have been conditioned to respond to standard signals, specific trumpet calls, or banner movements, to regroup and retreat in good order, a level of drilled coordination that was absent in the more individualistic feudal contingents. The outcome of Legnica was a catastrophic defeat for the European forces. It demonstrated that even the most advanced military thinking in the West, as encapsulated in the monastic manuals, was initially inadequate against the strategic depth and operational flexibility of the Mongol war machine. Their written knowledge, while sophisticated, was based on past experiences, lessons from the Crusades and classical antiquity. The Mongols represented something new, a system that operated on a different tactical and strategic wavelength altogether. The defeat at Legnica was a brutal, bloody lesson that knowledge must evolve, and that no manual, no matter how detailed, can ever be a substitute for adaptability and the ability to learn from a current, living enemy. Yet, the battle was not a complete repudiation of the Scholar Knight's methods. Instead, it highlighted the crucial distinction between having knowledge and achieving the unity of command necessary to implement it effectively. The Templar system was designed for a homogeneous, obedient military body like their own order. At Legnica, their tactics were diluted within a larger, traditionally minded feudal army that did not share the same doctrine or discipline. The real lesson of Legnica is that written knowledge is only as powerful as the institution that wields it. The Mongols possessed both a superior system and the unified command to execute it flawlessly. The Europeans possessed fragments of a superior system, but lacked the unity to bring it fully to bear. This painful experience, seared into the memory of those who survived, would have been precisely the kind of hard-won empirical data that the monastic orders were so adept at collecting, analyzing, and eventually incorporating into the next iteration of their ever-evolving tactical manuals, ensuring that even a shattering defeat would contribute to the slow, relentless accumulation of military wisdom. Imagine the vast digital archives of a modern military academy, today terabytes of data containing everything from drone footage analysis to psychological profiles of insurgent leaders. This seems a world away from a candlelit scriptorium where a monk knight painstakingly illustrates a trebuchet design. Yet, the fundamental principle connecting these two scenes, separated by nearly a millennium, is identical. The systematic, secure preservation and transmission of knowledge is the ultimate force multiplier in warfare. The scholar knights of the medieval monastic orders were the architects of this very idea, and their legacy is woven into the fabric of every professional military in the world today, a testament to their revolutionary understanding that victory is first achieved in the library, not on the battlefield. Consider the modern military doctrine manual, a document like the U.S. Army's Field Manual on Counterinsurgency. It is the product of a meticulous process. Observations from thousands of soldiers in the field are collected, analyzed by teams of experts at places like West Point or Sandhurst, synthesized with historical lessons from past conflicts, and then published and distributed to every relevant unit. This is not so different from a Templar preceptory in Jerusalem sending a request for information on Seljuk cavalry tactics to its outposts, receiving detailed reports from brothers who had engaged them in combat, having a scribe in Acre compile and annotate this data with references to classical Roman texts on light cavalry, and then sending the finalized manual back out to the network. Both systems rely on a continuous feedback loop between empirical experience and centralized analysis, creating a living, breathing body of knowledge that evolves with every new engagement. The medium has changed from vellum to PDF, but the mission remains the same: to ensure that the life or death lessons learned by one soldier today can save the life of another soldier tomorrow. The parallels extend into the very architecture of knowledge security. The monastic orders encrypted their most sensitive tactical insights within allegorical religious texts and complex ciphers, ensuring that only initiated members could access their full meaning. In the 21st century, this practice is mirrored in the multi-layered classification systems and encrypted digital networks used by modern militaries. A modern drone pilot's operating manual is not public information. It is stored on a secure server, accessible only to those with the correct clearance and need to know, protected by firewalls and passwords that are the direct descendants of the Templars' alphabet substitution codes. The threat has evolved from a rival knight capturing a scroll to a foreign state hacking a database, but the core imperative remains: protect your most valuable intellectual property, because in the wrong hands, a single tactical innovation can shift the balance of power. This historical thread leads us directly to the concept of the professional military education itself. Before the monastic orders, a knight's training was largely informal, passed from father to son, or learned through the brutal tuition of experience. The orders institutionalized learning. They created a curriculum, a standardized set of texts, and a structured environment where theory and practice were combined. A young Templar recruit didn't just train with a sword. He studied geometry for engineering, logistics for campaign planning, and horsemanship as a science. This is the prototype for every military academy in existence today. The hallowed halls of West Point, with its rigorous academic program alongside physical and tactical training, are the spiritual and intellectual successors to the training grounds and scriptoria of a Templar commandery. They both operate on the foundational belief that a warrior must be a scholar, that critical thinking and historical literacy are as vital to victory as physical courage and martial skill. Ultimately, the most profound lesson the Scholar Knights bequeath to modern military science is the timeless value of studying the past. Their entire intellectual project was built upon it, recovering classical texts, annotating them with contemporary experience, and preserving them for future generations. They understood that while technology changes, the fundamental principles of strategy, leadership, and human conflict possess a startling continuity. A modern Special Forces commander studying the Teutonic Order's winter warfare manuals for their insights on operating in the Arctic would not be engaging in a quaint historical exercise. He would be tapping into a deep well of empirical knowledge gathered in similarly harsh conditions. The specific tools are different skis and wool cloaks versus snowmobiles and Gore-Tex, but the core challenges of mobility, supply, and survival in a frozen landscape are enduring. By looking backward, we are often able to see the path forward with greater clarity. So the next time you hear about a military simulation or a war game, picture not just banks of computers, but also the ghost of a monk knight, moving pieces on a map in a quiet room, thinking through every possible outcome. That relentless drive to visualize, to calculate, to learn, and to prepare is their enduring gift. It is a reminder that in the endless dialogue between past and present, the most powerful weapon systems we possess are not the tanks or the jets, but the ideas, the institutional memory, and the hard-won wisdom passed down through the ages, ensuring that we are never truly starting from scratch, but always building upon the lessons of those who fought and learned before us. As we close this exploration of the secret Scholar Knights, remember that their greatest weapon was not the sword but the book, a vessel of wisdom that shaped centuries of warfare. These monastic orders understood something profound that we often forget in our focus on raw power. True strategy, the kind that endures and transforms, is born from knowledge meticulously preserved, thoughtfully analyzed, and carefully concealed. They mastered the art of hiding revolutionary ideas in plain sight, wrapping advanced engineering in spiritual allegory, and encoding battle plans within the beautiful borders of illuminated psalms. Their legacy forces us to completely rewrite our image of the medieval world, moving beyond the simplistic view of brute force and blind faith to reveal a hidden layer of sophisticated intellectual activity where piety and pragmatism met in the quiet of the Scriptorium. This story challenges us to look at history differently, to search for the hidden currents of knowledge that flow beneath the surface of great events. The next time you see an image of a knight in shining armor, see more than just the warrior. See the scholar, the engineer, the cartographer, and the scribe who stood behind him. Their work reminds us that progress often happens in the shadows, through the patient, unglamorous work of study and preservation. The most dramatic revolutions are sometimes the quietest, unfolding not in a single explosive battle, but across generations in libraries and writing rooms, where the ideas that will eventually change the world are being patiently copied, encrypted, and passed down. I encourage you to ponder how this dynamic of hidden knowledge continues to influence our own world today. We live in an age of digital encryption, corporate secrets, and algorithmic intelligence, modern scriptoria, where the future is being written in code instead of Latin. The core human impulse remains the same: to protect valuable information, to control its flow, and to use the advantage of knowledge to shape outcomes. The methods have changed, but the game is ancient. If you found this journey into the shadowy corridors of medieval monasteries as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. I want to hear your thoughts as well. What other secrets do you believe lie buried in ancient texts, waiting for the right key or the right technology to unlock their meaning? Share your ideas and questions in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for